It is being called a national tragedy. 7 members aboard the spacecraft Challenger streaking toward the outer reaches of the atmosphere at a force like no other. One moment racing into space, the next, a huge ball of fire.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
And nothing was left. And across this nation, people mourn in silent tribute to the fallen 7.
Moments on the possible after effects on children who may have watched the liftoff.
And we will also talk with the former head of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory about what might have caused the accident. But first,
it looked like a flawless, perfect launch. Then 72 seconds after takeoff, communications with the Space Shuttle Challenger broke off. NASA computer screens lighted up with flashing asterisks. The sky lighted up with a ball of fire, a scene burned into our memories. It all happened in less than a second. The explosion was as unexpected, of course, and just as huge. NASA says it won't predict how long this investigation will take. For a closer look at the disaster, CNN's Mike KAVANAGH with a report.
The spectacular sight had become routine, a shuttle on the launch pad.
T-minus 10, 9, 8,
Countdown.
7, 6. We have main engine start, 4, 3, 2, 1, and liftoff. Liftoff of the 25th Space Shuttle mission, and it has cleared the tower.
Now control.
Roger, roll, Challenger.
24 times a space plane had gone off, leaving behind a trail of smoke and fire. This time, the smoke and fire engulfed the Challenger as it hurtled through the clouds.
Engines throttling up. 3 engines now at 104%.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
Challenger, go at throttle up.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
Fragments of the billion-dollar craft fell into the Atlantic. Recovery forces sped to the rescue, but NASA knew there was probably no human life to retrieve. Spectators looked on from the ground, overwhelmed. Among the onlookers, the parents of Christa McAuliffe, who was to have been the first civilian in space. McAuliffe, a teacher from New Hampshire, specially trained for this mission, was on board with 6 astronauts. School children across the country had planned on watching McAuliffe teach 2 lessons from space on Friday. Also scheduled for this flight, a satellite launch. There were no ejection seats on the Challenger, but one space expert says they probably would not have helped. The nation responded to the tragedy millions had witnessed on television almost immediately. In Washington, the House paused for a minute of silence. The president, said to be shocked by the news, canceled his State of the Union address scheduled for tonight.
I think the president, like all Americans, has seen this tragedy unfold on television and has felt keenly what those family members must have felt watching that shuttle go into the air at the Cape, first pride and then second horror.
Senator Jake Garn chairs the committee which funds NASA and himself flew in space.
And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident.
Senator John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth, pointed out NASA's track record.
It's been an amazing success story up to this very tragic accident today. I think this was about the 56th or 57th manned mission, where we're dealing with new complexities and speeds and powers that man has never used before. And we had hoped to push this day back forever, but that was not to be.
In the history of the space program, 55 manned flights have been launched. 3 astronauts were killed in a fire on the launch pad in 1967. Never before has there been an American life lost in space. In the words of a spectator, this can't be real. We can't be watching this. Mike KAVANAGH, CNN.
The search for the shuttle's debris will resume at full force Wednesday at daybreak. With more on the search and the details of NASA's investigation, we go live now to CNN's Brian Nelson. He's standing by at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida. Brian, what can you tell us about the search for the fragments of the shuttle?
Well, before I do, Beverly, I'm going to tell you that what you're looking at right now is the NASA clock. It continues to tick away on what would have been the elapsed time on Challenger's mission. 12 hours, 27 minutes, 20 seconds. Instead, it marks the time since the country was jolted by a terrible tragedy. Tonight, ships from NASA, the military, and the Coast Guard are continuing the long and very difficult search for debris from Challenger. Air Force planes and helicopters were pulled off at darkness, and they'll resume the search effort at daybreak. But so far, both NASA and the Defense Department are being carefully guarded about what has been recovered.
They have brought some debris back to Canaveral. It has been impounded and will remain so until NASA tells us what they want done with it.
The search is being carried out over 6,000 square miles of ocean, about 50 to 100 miles southeast of the Kennedy Space Center. Although the world has been witness to this terrible accident on television, NASA has so far declined to offer any explanation for the explosion which took the lives of Challenger's 7 crew members.
We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy.
Some of the debris which fell to the waters of the Atlantic is being described as potentially hazardous by NASA. And the agency is now asking boaters and beachcombers that if they find anything, not to pick it up, but instead to call their local police. Beverly?
Brian, is there anything like a flight recorder or a transmission of the final moments that they're looking for?
Well, they don't have a flight recorder box that is similar to what is carried in aeroplanes. However, all of the data on the flight, which emanates from the spacecraft, is transcribed immediately onto computer tapes. So it is immediately sent back from the shuttlecraft onto computer tapes here on the ground. And I understand there are hundreds of those tapes right now, even from the short time between when the launch began and that terrible explosion took place. And NASA engineers are now poring over those tapes to try to determine what exactly went wrong.
Brian, when of course we watched the tragedy, we saw the two solid fuel boosters actually continue out from the explosion. And as we all know, certainly by now, those are reusable, and they seem to head off fairly much intact. Do the searchers have hopes of finding those two boosters?
I think that there is some hope that they can find them. I can't speculate as to what they have recovered so far. As I said earlier, NASA is being very guarded about what has been recovered, but they are probably the largest pieces that might be recovered in any search effort. But again, that is speculation because that explosion was so intense and so fierce that we can't really tell what has survived it.
Brian, earlier today, Vice President Bush was there to console the relatives of the crew members. Where are they tonight?
Well, NASA is being guarded about that too, but we believe that some of the families, if not all of them, remain on the site here in what is called the astronauts' quarters. We have had no access to them, as you can well imagine why.
And as for the search, when will it resume, and any estimate as to how long it'll take before we get some definitive information about what happened, what caused this explosion?
Well, the search is continuing right at this moment. Ships from the Coast Guard, from NASA, and from the military are out there right now in the waters behind me. They're continuing to patrol, searching for debris. In the morning, as soon as dawn breaks, they will be assisted by helicopters and planes, again from the Coast Guard and from the Air Force.
Thank you.
Now, as to how long that'll take, they're talking of perhaps several days at least for an intense search effort.
All right, thank you very much. CNN's Brian Nelson reporting from the Kennedy Space Center.
6 hours after the tragic explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger on Tuesday, President Reagan addressed the nation. For now, Mr. Reagan says we mourn the 7 people who died in the line of duty, but he adds the country will continue its quest in space. CNN's Frank Sesno has a report on the president's reaction to the disaster.
Gentlemen. The president watched in what was described as stunned silence, a video replay of the shuttle explosion. He postponed his State of the Union address, appearing instead in the Oval Office. He called it a day of mourning.
Nancy and I are pained to the core by the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain with all of the people of our country. This is truly a national loss.
Said the president, we mourn 7 heroes. He praised the astronauts' families and the astronauts themselves, who, he said, had a hunger to explore the universe.
We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers.
The president dispatched Vice President Bush to Cape Canaveral to deliver a personal message of support to the shuttle crew's families. Acting NASA Director Bill Graham was ordered back too and will head an investigation. For so many in Washington, the loss of the shuttle and its crew was like a loss in the family. A teacher in space was the president's idea. Christa McAuliffe had been to the White House. Senator Jake Garn had flown the shuttle last year and had developed special bonds.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen.
Yet Garn's confidence in NASA appears unshaken. He says he'd fly again. Congressman Bill Nelson flew the last shuttle and says despite Tuesday's horror, space exploration will proceed as long as humans thirst for knowledge.
We will continue to press outward. And in the process, there is risk. That risk is taken by each one of us every day, and that risk is understood by all the members of a crew that climb into a loaded spaceship.
The sense of loss, tragedy, and disbelief was no less keenly felt by those who'd never flown into space, and the House of Representatives held a mournful moment of silence.
We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here.
Mr. Reagan has ordered all flags on government property to be flown at half-staff until next Monday. The president had a special word for the school children of America who had watched as a teacher sought to make history. Painful things, the president said, are sometimes a part of exploration and discovery. Frank Sesno, CNN, the White House.
Coming up in our next section, as Frank Sesno reported, the school children, who of course were all urged to watch this because of the fact that the nation's first teacher in space was aboard. The question tonight is, what effect did it have on those kids? And we have a guest coming up shortly, Dr. IRENE Goldenberg, psychologist, professor at UCLA. We're going to talk to her about that, and we'll be talking with you.
Residents in Concord, New Hampshire, Christa McAuliffe's home, say that life there is at a standstill tonight. The day that started with such joy drew to a close with a memorial service at Ms. McAuliffe's church. CNN's Lee Green has a report about Ms. McAuliffe and her town.
She was, by all accounts, a remarkable woman, the first teacher in space, and loved by students, teachers, and townfolk alike at her home in Concord, New Hampshire. The students were watching the takeoff at school Tuesday morning. When the dimensions of the tragedy became clear, they were sent home, most of them in shock.
Just a lot of people and a lot of grief and a lot of shock. They said on TV that it blew up and everybody started crying. That's when I realized what happened.
It was hard to believe at first because there'd been so many others that were not so good, and this one not blew up.
Teachers and civic officials had a news conference at the school Tuesday afternoon.
We extend our sincere condolences to the McAuliffe family, particularly to Christa's immediate family, to their relatives and friends in this terrible hour of tragedy. The staff in particular are taking this event very, very, very sorrowfully.
Christa McAuliffe's house is being watched by Concord police. Her husband, parents, and other members of her immediate family were at Cape Canaveral when the disaster occurred. Concord was filled with pride when Christa was chosen and is now filled with sorrow at her tragic end. Services are planned at several Concord churches as friends and neighbors try to come to grips with their grief.
I think there's a real deep sense of loss, not just with myself, but obviously the whole community for that matter. And she was very well known and I'm sure very well loved by many, many people, and her loss is going to be very deeply felt.
NASA had chosen absolutely the best person in the country to be the teacher in space, and correspondingly devastated.
She was delighted to have been selected and had planned to keep a diary of her space adventure, a kind of ordinary person's impression of life in space. History has been robbed of that unique perspective, and Concord has lost a fine educator and a dear friend. Lee Green, CNN, Concord, New Hampshire.
In his speech Tuesday, mourning the deaths of the Challenger astronauts, President Reagan made a special effort to speak to the children about the tragedy.
I want to say something to the school children of America who were watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but sometimes painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew was pulling us into the future, and we'll continue to follow them.
In our Los Angeles studio, we have with us Dr. Irene Goldenberg, a psychologist and a professor at UCLA. She's with us to talk about that subject, how the children who did watch the tragedy today might be affected. Welcome to Newsnight, Dr. Goldenberg.
Thank you.
How do you feel that children would be affected by this? Are they indeed going to be traumatized, shocked? Is this that much different than a child watching the DC Delta crash in Dallas last summer? How are they affected when they see these?
Yes, I think it is different. For one thing, we're all traumatized and shocked, and I think children are the same. And because this was much more closer and more personal and more connected to something that they knew, to somebody that's within their world, a teacher that's next to a parent, as the kind of person that you know, then it's close to you.
Doctor, these children were very excited in anticipation of seeing Ms. McAuliffe up there, giving them a lesson from outer space. And then all of a sudden, before their very eyes, death unfolds. How are they going to deal with that kind of trauma, number one, and what's the best way for a teacher or a parent to explain that?
Well, for one thing, I think there's going to be a wide range of how they respond, just as there was a wide range of how people responded today throughout the country. Everybody felt a sense of shock and a sense of personal loss, and children will feel that too. But depending upon what your internal resources are and what's happening in your life and what's going on depends upon the degree of disturbance or upset. And in reference to your comment about what to do about it, I think the president had the right idea. You have to talk about it. You have to talk about what it means to you. I think each family has a different feeling about what death is about and how it affects our life. And those are very different in different places. But those are the kinds of things you share with your children. You share them at the level that the children are.
I know one thing that I even found difficult to deal with was seeing it over and over and over again. How is a child going to deal with that? Because all of the networks have been playing that videotape again and again and again.
And we sit with fascination. I think that children should not in any way be forced to watch this, but I think sometimes watching something again and again makes us able to work through it and to kind of make it make some sense for us. I wouldn't turn it off, but on the other hand, if they were finished with it and didn't want to look at it anymore, I think you ought to respect that also.
I read the comments also on by another psychologist in New York today who said that pointed to the news people, the anchors on the four networks, as having a soothing quality in this kind of tragedy. Do you share that?
Well, I think that there's a sense of adults being in control that's always important. I think there's also a sense that you saw on a couple of the news anchors that they were visibly moved and upset. I think adults have to show both. One, that they're in control, and another, that they have feelings that are connected with this.
This type of instantaneous tragedy different for a child than, say, having a parent suffer from a long illness and die, or having someone else suffer from a long illness and die? What's the difference in those two types of deaths?
Well, I think there's an extraordinary degree of difference. One is that a remove from you, and though it may be temporarily upsetting, it doesn't have the impact and the power of losing a parent. But what can happen is when things are not too good around you, when a family member is ill or seems to be in danger or is in some other difficulty, that something that comes close like this can agitate a child and further upset them.
What do you feel the national psyche is. In a country like ours, it's been pointed out a couple of times, to say the least today, that this country tends to wear its emotions on its sleeve, seeing the Kennedy assassination, seeing tragedies over and over through the years, and this national mourning that continues to be with us, whereas in other countries, the Soviet Union, this kind of thing would not receive the play that it gets in this country. What does that do to the national psyche?
Well, it's a little presumptuous maybe, but I think that's what makes Americans partly so wonderful, is their vulnerability and their openness to experience and their ability to respond to it without covering it over.
We are going to take your phone calls now, and one thing that comes to mind before we open the phones is earlier Vice President Bush characterized the astronauts as really epitomizing the American spirit in terms of their bravery and their courage to pursue knowledge of the unknown for the sake of knowledge. And I think that that's one of the things we should not forget tonight, is the positive and the good that they did for us. All right, we're going to open up the phones right now. First caller, where are you calling from, and what is your comment or your question for Dr. Goldenberg?
My name's Rick. I'm calling from Beverly Hills, California, and I'm interested in the emotional impact on the friends and relatives of those members and how we can best deal with resolving these problems. Of course, it comes as shock, but how can we deal in resolving our problems and deep concerns towards this?
That's a very personal thing, and I think that the kind of loss that goes with losing a parent or losing a spouse really cannot be minimized. It's the maximum kind of horrible experience that can occur, and what you would hope is that those people would have friends, relatives, support systems, and even professional help if it's necessary.
Here's another caller for you, Doctor. Go ahead, please. Calling from where? Your question or comment tonight?
Yes, my name is Gary. I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and what I'd like to ask the lady is basically, what is a good way to get the children to open up about this? My youngest is 4 years old, and she doesn't seem to really understand what happened, which I think is probably good for her at this stage of her life. My boy, though, is 7 years old. He is in second grade, and he really didn't want to talk about it that much. He just said, well, he just said it's sad. He said she's a teacher. And then her picture came on the TV, and the group photo, that is, and he, pointed to her and said that was her there. And I'm wondering what's going through his mind right now. I try to get him to open up a little bit about it, but I think he's as shocked as we are about it. But I know that when children are that small, though, that it's going to have more of an impact, and he'll think about this. He was even talking about saving the front page from the newspaper today, and we were talking about history and that type of thing. But, is this good, or what can I do to help him open up and cope with this?
All right, good question.
It sounds like you've done most of what needs to be done at this point, which is you've been open and interested and responsive to his needs, and that's really what's important. And if you can tell him a little bit about how you're feeling. I don't think you need to corner children, nor are children articulate enough to always explain what they're feeling, but to give them the opportunity to talk, and to talk a little bit about how it makes you feel, and to retreat and not insist on their opening up to you until they're ready. It may take a little while. You may pick it up in watching their play, or it may indeed fade away fairly rapidly.
Dr. Goldenberg, can children, very young children, differentiate between what they see on the news and what they see in regular television programming, that which is make-believe?
I think it's very difficult for them to do that. Children 4 years old, etc. And those are very difficult decisions for children to make, and sometimes adults do have to help them decide this is a pretend thing.
All right,
and
next
this is a real thing.
Next caller, where are you calling from, and what is your question or comment?
Yes, how you doing? My name is Pat. I'm calling from Garfield, New Jersey. And it's really strange the way that people are just fascinated with this thing, watching it over and over. I'm sick to my stomach. I can't watch this on TV. I purposely didn't watch the news. I mean, it's really sickening that human nature, makes you look at these things over and over, and people are making jokes about it today, and I'm really disgusted.
Doctor, why are
anybody else share this?
Doctor, why are we so fascinated by seeing that again and again?
Well, I think that people have different ways of making something real for them. Something that's, as you said, the difference between fantasy and reality can be difficult for adults, too. Some people find it too real and retreat from it and refuse to look at it. Some people try to make it make sense to themselves by repeating it over and over again. And I really think that there's a wide variety of how people respond. Not everybody should expect it all to be the same.
Another call for you now, Doctor. Go ahead, please. Calling from where? Your question or comment tonight, please.
Yes, I'm calling from Moore Park, California, and as Dr. Goldenberg knows, it's a warm night in Southern California. My window was open this evening, and a bunch of children were screaming and yelling, playing kickball or something outside the door, and I became infuriated with these children because they didn't know what happened today and how significant to me it should have been to them or to any other American. How can I deal with this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it's just a question of everybody really dealing with their grief in a different way. Some people deal with their grief by denying it, and then to some people it doesn't really have the same impact and the same meaning as maybe it does to you. Give it some time.
All right. We would like you to stay with us, if you would, Dr. Goldenberg, Dr. Irene Goldenberg, psychologist, professor at UCLA. We'd like you to stay with us. We want to take a break right now, and we'll be back and we'll take more of your phone calls and talk with the doctor some more. We're going to talk some more with Dr. Irene Goldenberg, psychologist, professor at UCLA, and also we would like to remind you that in a few moments we'll be joined by another guest in Los Angeles, Bruce Murray, the former director of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
But first, we'd like to get back to your calls for Dr. Goldenberg. Next caller, where are you calling from and what is your question for the doctor this evening or comment?
My name is Kathy Layton, and I'm calling from Hattiesburg, Mississippi. And I just wanted to ask Dr. Goldenberg, I have a 4- and a 5-year-old, and we have watched CNN all day and kept up with the coverage of the catastrophe today. And my children, you know, they realize what has happened. They know that 7 people has gone up into the air and they've seen the explosion and they know that they're dead, and they know, you know, they understand what has happened to these people. Mm-hmm. Now, what I'm concerned about with them, they seem to handle the situation very well. They understand it and they can cope with it. But their daddy is flying home from Guatemala this Friday. And normally, my kids love airplanes. They're infatuated with the whole situation.
So they're very concerned and frightened now about his flight home?
Right. They're scared to death for Daddy to get on that airplane because they think now that that airplane's going to blow up, and I don't know how to talk to them about it.
Doctor, what should she say to her children?
Well, first of all, I imagine you're feeling a lot of anxiety yourself, and that you're going to have to separate out in your mind the difference between their daddy flying home on a commercial airline flight and a shuttle going off. And I think that's the same kind of differentiation you'll have to make from them. And I don't think either one of you are going to, any of you are going to be terribly comfortable until he comes home.
Let's take another call now. Doctor, go ahead, please. Your comment or question is tonight, and you're calling from where, please?
This is M.C. Johnson from Atlanta. I wonder if there's been any word as to the reaction of the children of the crew members, and what is the best way that the families can cope with what they saw happen to their parents today?
No, that's a really long-term question. Nobody really copes with that kind of disaster well. It's going to be something that'll have to be worked out for each of the families. And as I suggested before, possibly not only with their family and friends, but with some kind of special therapeutic help. There are some studies being done on children who've been exposed to seeing the death of their parents, and it really is a terrible shock, produces a syndrome that we call post-traumatic syndrome that's much like the kind of thing that occurs when adults are exposed to war and horrifying experiences such as that. Sometimes it needs professional help.
I wonder if you could, I think we did somewhat touch on this, but I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about the difference between this and other tragedies that we witness. I recall not all that long ago we were reporting on, and I'm not sure whether you happened to see this particular story or not, but there was a young man who went into a convenience store, and the video camera in the convenience store captured on tape this young man's murder by robbers in that convenience store. And we all saw that, and he died. And yet there seems to be a difference.
But there is, yes, but I think there is a difference. In one case, you're talking about an individual that's a distance from you psychologically and in reality. In another case, you're talking about superheroes that exist in front of us. Superheroes, even the teacher was a superhero, super teacher that was going in and that represented something symbolically. And when those people are exposed to danger, when those people are vulnerable, and when those people die, it really upsets us.
We want to thank you for joining us tonight, Dr. Irene Goldenberg, a psychologist and professor at UCLA. Thanks for talking with us about this so that we get a better understanding of how we all feel about it tonight. And thank you, callers.
And coming up in our next segment, Bruce Murray, the former director of NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, will be with us. We'll be back in a moment.
The Challenger launch was to be the second of 15 missions NASA had planned for this year. It certainly started off as a routine liftoff, and then only seconds into the flight, something went wrong. Now tonight, CNN's Don Lennox takes a look at slow-motion pictures that may help determine what happened.
Video showed the explosion of Challenger in excruciating detail, but it did not initially reveal the cause. The explosion came a little more than a minute after launch at a point where one of the shuttle's two solid rocket boosters attached to the shuttle. While NASA has videotapes and still photographs of the disaster, Associate Administrator Jesse Moore says more evidence will be gathered.
Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy.
The first visible sign of a problem was the explosion itself, but slow-motion replays of the final seconds of flight show what appears to be a fire near the lower end of one of the shuttle's solid rocket boosters. Moments later, a second fire seems to be visible between Challenger and its volatile external fuel tank. A fuel line from that tank to the shuttle to power its three main engines runs along the underside of the space shuttle. Less than a second after the fire appeared, it seemed to trigger a huge fireball that enveloped the entire shuttle. All that remained were two solid rocket boosters careening out of control. Don Lennox, CNN Space Watch.
The space experts and government officials are now trying to assess the impact of this disaster, what kind of impact it will have on the U.S. space program. And joining us now from our Los Angeles Bureau is Professor Bruce Murray. He is an expert on the space program.
Dr. Murray is the former director, in fact, of JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California. Welcome to Newsnight, Professor Murray.
Thank you.
It has been said that, in fact, John Glenn said today that this was a day that everyone associated with the space program had hoped could be put off forever, but then many who subscribed to the law of averages said that it was going to happen. If it's bound to happen this time, it's bound to happen again. What does this do to this kind of program in terms of the inevitability of this type of tragedy?
Well, I think it's looking at the glass half empty or half full. The thing that makes us exciting, the reason that we project ourselves into these individuals and these events is because indeed they are at the cutting edge. This is pioneering. The flip side of that is there's risk, and occasionally there will be unavoidable accidents. You can't have it both ways, and I don't think that's really an issue. I think that it's been known to be risky. Frankly, from my point of view, I've been amazed how smoothly and successful the program's gone overall. I think NASA's been very, very careful. And as Glenn said, the law of averages eventually does get you. And on some long time scale, there will be other accidents. The last one was what, for America, was 19 years ago. They're not very frequent, but they're traumatic when they happen, and they remind us that we're paying a cost, not just money, but occasionally human lives, in order that we can all push out to space together.
Professor Murray, you've seen the tape of the accident all day long. What do you think might have happened? Might it have been something with the fuel line, a seam in the rocket booster?
I really haven't got a clue.
Have you thought about it at all today?
Well, I think everybody thinks about it, but those pictures are tantalizing, but they really are just a shadowy image, and you need much more information, which is what's happening now, and NASA properly is focusing first on being sure all the data are collected properly and compiled properly, and then immediately we'll start the investigation. So there's a lot of curiosity about it, but the fact of the matter is you really need to know the facts, and there are probably a large number of facts that pertain to it.
You have no thoughts on it?
No.
Do you think today's tragedy means a loss of political support in Congress for the space program?
No, I was very impressed with the President's response. He, I think, correctly assesses the mood of the American people, just as what happened in the past with the Apollo fire, which after all was less than 3 years before the greatest achievement in space of all, going to the moon, took place. And I think there's a lot of parallelism here. I think we'll come back more committed than ever, more realistic perhaps about the risks that are involved. And if anything, the kind of questions that will be triggered will not be so much of why have these lives been lost. I think that's not a difficult question to answer. I think the questions that may be catalyzed by the process are, where are we going in space? Where does all this lead? I think it's a very good set of questions for us to have.
My understanding is that after that fire 19 years ago on the launch pad, the results were some dramatic changes in the approach to leaving the Earth and getting into space. Do you, are there some rather profound theories these days that there would be a better way than the liquid hydrogen, which is just an incredibly explosive way to get into space?
My own perception is of the accident that took place with Apollo was there we were trying to build up to do the technology. It hadn't yet been done. And so it raised questions, of course, as maybe we're completely on the wrong track and there's some real showstopper there. In the current case, we've flown the shuttle many times. We know there's no profound problem. Something obviously terribly bad went wrong, but it must not be a consistent problem or we would have hit it before. So I doubt very much that anything's going to come out of here that's going to radically change the shuttle or how it's operated.
Professor, what do you think today's accident means in terms of future civilians going up in space? Do you think that NASA thoroughly assessed the dangers of that?
I really think they did. I think that was well understood. I think the people involved all understood it. You know, NASA thrives and represents imagination. It represents taking chances for good things. The fact that as a government agency, they're willing to take the risk of taking a popular teacher in a televised way and risking her life along with that of the crew is a measure of just how much risk they're willing to take. But I don't think they're imprudent risks.
So you think we'll continue to see that, civilians going up?
Yes, I'm sure we will. I really think, and I really feel deeply, that the trauma that this represents will spin back in the form of a perhaps even more focused commitment to go beyond just the first exploitation of Earth orbit, but to Mars, to really important long-term historical things in the next century, for which this is just the beginning.
Looking ahead here, again in the theoretical area, I'm wondering, I believe I have read and heard that there is some idea that one day, rather than a vertical, which is a very difficult way, obviously takes the most thrust, that one day we will see craft that involve jet propulsion to the outer limits of our atmosphere, where a jet then would no longer function, and then switch to a rocket propulsion that would then carry you beyond our atmosphere and beyond the gravity. Do you see that coming soon?
There's apparently some work of that preliminary nature going on, but not to take humans, to take machines and robots. I think in that sense that we are now, at this point, 26, 27 years beyond the beginning of the chemical rocket age. What you're describing are significant advancements beyond that, and they're probably 20 or 30 years in the future, too, certainly as far as taking humans up.
All right, sir. Well, it's safe to say that the future for space exploration is going to be exciting, to say the least, and I'm, you know, I get out of the, we certainly want to thank you, Professor Bruce Murray, former director of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena. Thank you for joining us tonight, sir. You know, you get a feeling out of all of this, as tragic as it was, that the national mood does seem to be that, as tragic as this has been, that the programs will certainly continue and the advancements are not going to be stifled all that great.
There's still a commitment to it, fortunately, because after all, that's what the 7 died for.
Yeah.
We will have a live report from Mission Control in Houston when we come back with Frank Seltzer. We'll be right back.
Well, NASA officials tonight certainly are trying to determine what went wrong aboard Challenger.
CNN's Frank Seltzer is standing by live at Mission Control at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. He will bring us up to date on what's going on there. Frank?
Beverly, basically what's been going on here is that the people at the Johnson Space Center are trying to go over the data, try to find out what happened. Earlier this evening we talked to the former director of the Johnson Space Center, which is Gerald Griffin. He just left as director 2 weeks ago. The new director, Jess Moore, has not come in yet. Griffin said when he walked into Mission Control, people were sitting there at their consoles, quietly going over the data, but Griffin seemed to think that the data that Johnson actually had here probably wouldn't tell them much. He felt the photographic information, once it's enhanced, might be the best clue. He wouldn't speculate as to what was going on, and he said that now there will be a review team, which will take weeks, as they will do a very specific logic tree, going down, trying to pinpoint exactly what went wrong. Challenger, this was going to be the 10th flight of the Challenger. Its maiden voyage was back in April of 1983, and it was the workhorse of the NASA's fleet. But as CNN's Chuck Roberts report, Challenger was not without problems.
March 1983. The shuttle Challenger stuck on the launch pad because of what appeared to be an ongoing design flaw in its 3 main engines. Engineers found small cracks which could have leaked explosive hydrogen into the rear portion of the shuttle during launch. The engines were modified and replaced, but the head of a government investigative committee later concluded the modifications were not enough to safely fix the problem. Challenger wasn't the only shuttle involved, since shuttle engines are interchangeable. The engines are not only traded between shuttles, they're subjected to continuing engineering changes.
There has been a history of problems with the Space Shuttle's 3 main engines going back to the very start of the program in the early 1970s. NASA has been in the process of changing the design of those engines all along, even as it was launching so-called operational, supposedly mature missions.
When Challenger finally did complete its 1983 mission, another chilling problem came to light. After the landing, NASA revealed a fault in one of the Challenger's reusable rocket boosters that could have caused the shuttle to veer out of control or explode during launch.
There have been several flights where there was evidence of the nozzle being within a hair's breadth of failure, and these were in some recent flights.
There have been some problems with solid rocket motors in the past. I believe these have been corrected, but as you recall, a couple of satellites were temporarily lost in 1984 due to failures of solids.
Those booster problems were traced to faulty materials in the manufacturing process. NASA has made no mention of the past engine or booster episodes in connection with Tuesday's disaster. Biddle is drawing no conclusions either, but says NASA may find clues in Challenger's unsettled history. Chuck Roberts, CNN Space Watch.
Of course, all the people here at the Johnson Space Center will point out that the Challenger, like its sister ships, is a very complicated vehicle. There are many things that can go wrong, and it is still far too early to even speculate as to what may have been the problem that caused the disaster.
Frank, it was also Challenger, was it not, last summer that on a mission lost an engine at something like five minutes into the mission, and that's the one that involved a somewhat shortened, abbreviated mission. Was there any, have you heard any discussion about that? You referred to it in your report, of course. There have been some near misses, at least speculated on.
It depends what you define as a near miss. Now, NASA's very safe. To say that there's been near misses, near problems, well, yeah, it's a complicated vehicle. As to whether or not there was any connection, no, I would doubt it. You know, those were engines shut down. That was a specific problem. We can't say what the problem was this time. Max Faget, one of the designers of the early on in the shuttle, had reportedly made some comment. He thought it was a coincidence that there seemed to be some trouble near the aft connector. But there again, other people I've talked to around NASA say, well, you know, it looked further aft of that, further down on the shuttle as to where the trouble may have been. It's far too early to even guess that past problems may have gone out. And you should note that all of the engines on board the shuttle are interchangeable. They use ones from Discovery, they use ones from all the other shuttles. They can pull one out, put one on. I'm not even sure at this point what engines were on Challenger on this mission, if it was the same engines that flew earlier last year.
Okay, we certainly thank you for the update, Frank, and we'll come back to you as warranted at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, and we'll continue with our extended coverage here on CNN, the tragedy in the skies over Florida today.
We will continue our extensive coverage of the explosion aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger in 30 minutes on Newsnight Update.
We will also have an interview with, of course, the noted science author Ray Bradbury. Next on CNN will be Crossfire, and among the guests, Florida Congressman Bill Nelson, who himself was, of course, a passenger aboard the Space Shuttle earlier in the month. I'm Patrick Emery.
And I'm Beverly Williams. Be sure to join us in 30 minutes. And America watched in shock Tuesday as the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. Here now is a look at some reaction.
1 minute, 15 seconds. Velocity 2,900 feet per second. Altitude 9 nautical miles. Downrange distance 7 nautical miles.
It is with deep, heartfelt sorrow that I address you here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately a minute and a half after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived.
You get chills, you know, when you first hear about it. And, I don't know, you know, you start wondering why, you know, they're doing it and why they're going up so often and that type of stuff.
It hit me kind of hard.
Everybody was shocked. If I went silent, nobody spoke, just watched in stunned silence.
Well, it's very difficult for me to talk about it because these were my friends. Mike Smith, the pilot, was my mother hen the first month that I trained. They assigned him to me, go to my classes and help brief me. And I don't know of any time that I have been more shocked or more moved than when my first wife was killed in an automobile accident. I guess